All right, welcome to the No Show. My name is Andrea Edwards.
And my name is Joe Augustin.
My name is Tim Wade.
He's looking exceptionally handsome. Is this Halloween?
Well, I thought we were going to be talking about cybersecurity today, so I thought I'd better look the part.
Right, okay. That's
really nice to be on
probably
the...
better and less insulting.
It's nice to be on the show, a very disheveled Andy Warhol.
It does look a little bit Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol and Austin Powers had a love child.
Yeah, right. Yeah, very handsome.
Yeah, baby.
All right,
Joe,
shall we
who's our guest today?
Yeah, let's introduce our guest. Oh, he's stunned into silence.
Oh, hi guys! I thought, hi. Great
No, Joe was supposed to be talking.
I think Joe
Is that what
Joe
happened? I think I may have been putting on my pants at the time. So here's a terrible secret that I have, right? I'm good with people. I know who they are, but I am terrible with actual names. So for me, I got very far to remember that his name was Andrew, and people call him Andy. But right now, his surname escapes me. He is someone who is a bit of an expert in the area of cybersecurity, cyber threats, and all that kind of stuff. And I know this because I was actually on a stage with him not 3 hours ago, so I should know this a lot better. So, Andrew, would you rescue me and just do a fuller introduction of yourself?
Thanks, Joe. You've introduced me twice in the last 2 days, or 3 times, including this. But yeah,
I will sink deeper into my hole now. While you...
Well, let me do the introduction then.
I mean, you've been doing so many introductions. Honestly, it's been you must be getting a bit exhausted anyway, Joe. I know I'm a bit tired because we've had an event for the last couple of days. It's been it's been pretty intense, really, Joe, hasn't it? But very good.
Yeah.
So I'm Andrew Milroy. As you've indicated, I've been in the analyst consulting business for many years. Recently, I set up my own cybersecurity advisory firm called Vector 8. So I provide advice to clients on the risks that they face, the cyber risks, the digital risks that they face, and talk to them about ways in which they can address it in a very commoditized way. And I use business English as much as possible. I do my best to avoid using technical English when I do that kind of work with folks. I also work with a bunch of other partners. CIO Academy is one of them, and I work a lot with them and their clients on cybersecurity related projects.
And I've known Andy for an incredibly long time. He's probably the person I've most connected with professionally that I'm still connected with. We used to work together in London in the 90s. So, but the other thing is, Andy and I have had many arguments on many topics over the years. But I've always had a lot of respect for your knowledge and the fact that you always dig in. You never take anything at face value. So we're really happy to have you here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
All right.
I especially like your work when you played Elliot Carver in James Bond's Tomorrow Never Dies.
Oh dear.
Thank you.
Oh, that's Jonathan Price.
At this point, I'm wondering if Andy has any idea what Tim Wade looks like in real life.
Well, I was about to say, what does the real Tim Wade look like?
Yeah, okay. Well, it's not quite Halloween yet, is it?
Yeah.
All right.
I don't know. If I was Andy, I'd be more concerned that people think that that's how you should dress when you're talking about cybersecurity.
Well, I feel overdressed now.
We should also explain for the ones who are listening on the podcast, Tim's voice is affected by the prosthetic teeth that he's got on.
Yeah.
Because visually, this makes no sense at all. Orally, it makes no sense at all.
All right, so I'm looking forward to getting stuck into the conversation around cybersecurity, but let's go through the news that really struck a chord this week. So for the first week in a very, very, very long time, there's no big chunky piece of global news that got everyone's attention. So that actually makes it harder for me to pull the news together that matters. So there's probably more, but I'll try and go through it quite rapidly. And you guys just jump in on anything that sort of speaks to you. But the big news this morning that we woke up to, especially in Asia Pacific, is that Facebook is now Meta. Now, based on the conversation I'm seeing on Facebook, it does not mean that Facebook is changing its name. It means that the parent company is changing its name to Meta. like Alphabet is for Google, right? A name that didn't really catch on, but it's all part of Facebook's attempt to improve its shattered image. So that's one of the reasons for it. The other is it's in line with its plans to build a metaverse. And so this has been explained as a place where people can game, work, and communicate in a virtual environment, often using VR headsets. So this sort of reminds me of a movie that I saw where the future didn't look very nice. What is a metaverse? Well, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't even know. But Andy, do you want to give it a crack?
I'll give it a crack, and I'll give it a crack why I think they've done what they've done. It's similar to Google with Alphabet. They don't want to be associated with simply one product. So Google didn't want to be associated with purely search engines and advertising because they're in lots of other businesses as well. And Facebook doesn't want to just be associated with one social media platform. They're moving into other businesses. And one of the areas that they're looking at moving into, or they are starting to move into, is the so-called metaverse. And I don't know, are any of you guys familiar with a lot of kids play in these kinds of environments? Are any of you guys familiar with Roblox?
Yeah.
So Roblox, you kind of have your own avatar, you have a virtual currency there. Almost, I say to my kids, see if you can find a way of converting the Robux into real currency, right? So, I mean, there might be a way sooner or later, but they kind of live in this virtual world. Their friends hang out there. They have these avatars. They buy stuff with this currency that we give them, actually. I mean, I feel terrible doing it, but we buy it in Singapore dollars and it's converted into Robux, which is the currency that's used in this environment. And they have this kind of virtual existence. And that is what Facebook's looking at, but on a much, I think, bigger scale and not specifically focused on kids. Having said that, Roblox is looking at entering other markets and, creating equivalent kinds of metaverses, let's say, for adults. But broadly, that's my kind of understanding of it. I mean, this stuff already exists. Our kids are in it. Facebook's looking at just taking it much further and getting adults more involved in these kinds of environments.
Yeah, and
like a Bruce Willis movie, Surrogates.
Surrogates, yeah. There's another one where they're all living in dumps, but they escape into these virtual worlds. And I think a lot of people, especially. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that sounds right. I think a lot of people will automatically go into a place of fear. What does this mean? But I don't know. My big issue around this is, for Facebook or Meta, is, this all-in approach, fine. We're moving in, our children have grown up in this environment, so moving into this environment in a bigger way obviously makes sense. But until they really address the underlying issues that have caused the problems and the technology algorithms that have caused the problems and the divisions that they create and the problems they're creating all around the world through elections and stuff, I don't care how many times they change their name. They've got to address the problem that they've created. All the social media companies do, but I think Facebook in particular needs to be on the ball with that. And
yeah, can I jump in here, guys? I don't want to dominate the conversation too much around this, but I mean, that's a real bugbear of mine, because Facebook is the information source for such a large proportion of the world's population today. So if you go to a lot of Southeast Asian countries, I'm not sure exactly in Thailand, but certainly in Indonesia, in the Philippines, it is the source of information for so many people. And misinformation is being peddled there to a horrendous degree by various vested interests, a mix of nation states and no doubt others as well. So, you talk to guys I've spoken to folks in Indonesia about, the pandemic, and, I've had conversations where I've said to somebody, are you vaccinated? What's the take-up like? Are you guys able to get vaccines? And they've said, yeah, in Jakarta, it's not a problem. Although to read the news, you believe there was a lack of supply. They go, no, in Jakarta, it's not a problem. It's just that people are scared of the vaccines that are available. They want the Chinese ones, they'll say. A lot of people want the Chinese ones because they believe the Chinese ones are less dangerous than these Western ones. And the Chinese ones were, in inverted commas, tested on Chinese or tested on Asians. And China knows better because that's where it came from in the first place, the disease. So there's this, and China's handling it better, right? So there's this narrative that, in this case, we can assume it's a nation state that's behind it, but there's this narrative going around a lot of Southeast Asian countries that's very destructive, and Facebook isn't doing enough to address it. I mean, it's only partially doing it in the English language, let alone Bahasa Indonesian, Thai, Tagalog, and so forth. And that's a huge project for it to get onto those other countries.
Yeah, I just found out some friends. One of my friends is in hospital with a pretty serious case of COVID. He looks like he's going to be okay. And they basically did a blood test and the Sinovac. So we all got Sinovac sort of June, July. So it's now October, and it's basically non-existent in his system. So in Thailand, they've brought in boosters. So we've been able to get an AstraZeneca, but my friend hadn't had a booster. So, the whole Sinovac sort of side of things, if you've had that, please look into it. Because, this friend of mine is had a pretty rough week.
Yeah, from what I've heard, it's better than nothing. I mean, you don't want to discredit it and tell people not to take that. If it's available, take it. But from the research that's been done indicates the efficacy of some of the other ones is higher. But I think the challenge in some countries is people were actually, and some people even in Singapore, are rejecting some of the available vaccines, whether it be AstraZeneca or Pfizer or Moderna. Yeah.
Well, as far as he's concerned, he got a blood test and he's got no Sinovac left in his system after a few months. So, another big story that sort of started to emerge earlier in the week was the military coup in Sudan. Did you guys have you guys been having a look at that one?
Yeah, I saw that, and it seemed I was actually quite struck by how the BBC seemed very partisan on it. They seem to have a very clear view of which side they were on that, and it seemed like a very interesting thing about how people, like he just lost patience with leadership and then said, "Okay, I'll drive."
Yeah, I think it's a little bit more to it than that. And there was one BBC article I shared with you, which I thought was pretty interesting. So the guy who took over is a guy called General Burhan. And obviously the impact on Sudan has been pretty swift. Their international standing as an emerging democracy is obviously on the line. Debt relief, international aid as well. And obviously the peace negotiations with the rebels, that's the big issue. But it wasn't a country at peace. We could see all the protests. But so why is that happening now, right? That's the big issue. He was one of the most powerful men in the country. Why did he need to do it? Well, so it turns out he was, based on the agreement with the new government, he was going to be stepping down in a few months. But if he steps down, he could then be held up for culpability for human rights abuses. So the government, the civilian government, which he's overtaken, have agreed in principle to hand ex-President Bashir over to the International Criminal Court, and his former lieutenants, and General Burhan was one of them, basically have been trying to get him to be tried in Sudan, not in The Hague, because they believe that Bashir will actually name them, him included, for the alleged atrocities that basically happened during the Darfur War. So it's a self-protection mechanism. But this year's been a time of coups, right? And I couldn't help but link it back to the coup in Myanmar earlier this year, which, that's just literally over the border. We could drive to the border in a couple of hours. And, it's just created such an amazing amount of suffering for the Burmese people with COVID and the economic fallout. But what's been really interesting about that story just this week or in this last week is the general who seized power back in February has been told he cannot attend the Asian summit that's coming up in the next couple of weeks. And this is seen as an unprecedented move for the 10-member bloc nations in ASEAN, because basically they traditionally don't get involved in each other's politics. So I thought that was a pretty interesting side of the story as well. But yeah, it's been a time of coups, a time of stepping back, and it's
I'm afraid to say,
helping the people.
I think across the globe, there's a move towards authoritarianism. There's a lot of a move against democracy taking place at the moment. The tide seems to be turning a little bit. Hopefully it won't go too far, and the world seems to be divided based on whether it's more in the so-called democracy camp or the authoritarian camp. And we're finding again manipulation by some of the powers to try to encourage some of these coups and to create countries that are more aligned with their way of governance.
Yeah, and the whole populism as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and the Facebook. Yeah, and
easy to do.
The
we need a
Facebook
strong government. target minorities, say, look, it's the fault of these minority groups. Not hard. Throw red meat to the mainstream population.
Yeah.
And
when
you're in.
We do get sucked in, don't we? The mob.
Democracy's weak. That kind of argument, right?
Oh, by the way, in totally unrelated news, there's 2 new websites that just come up: Meta Sudan and Meta Myanmar.
Okay.
That's a callback. It's a terrible thing to do in the middle of serious news, but yeah.
Right. Another breaking story, which just in the build up to the show, I found out has changed. So Andy, you can jump in. But the Democrats, in order to pay for their agenda, looks like they want to tax the billionaires. So the idea is that billionaires would be taxed on the unrealized gains in the value of their liquid assets. So this is stocks, bonds, and cash. And the tax would be levied on anyone with more than $1 billion in assets or more than 100 million in income for 3 consecutive years. So this is about 700 people in the United States.
Yes.
But Andy, you're saying that this is already changing?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm all for taxing them. And my understanding, just in something I read today, was that I think they've just something I read just a bit earlier is I think a decision has been made not to tax the individuals, but to raise corporate tax for profits of more than $1 billion is what I read recently. I mean, maybe that's less. Maybe I can't guarantee that that's exactly what's happening, but that's what I read a few hours ago.
Yeah.
So that's my understanding of what's happening. I think the issue with individuals is it's in a way there aren't that many of them, right? So as you say, about 700 billionaires. So you're targeting a very small number of people, and it's going to be quite tricky. The cost of actually getting to them and deciding which elements of their income you're going to tax and how to do it would probably be quite high. So it's probably simpler for them to put a system in place targeting a certain level of corporate profits. But again, there are ways around that too. I think a lot of this when they target when they use that terminology is somewhat symbolic. I mean, it's hard to disagree with them in doing it, but it's symbolic. They're not, even if they got those guys, they wouldn't get anything like enough to cover their spending bills that they're talking about. Even if they did get 100 million, 10 million, 20 million extra out of those people.
They can hide their money
of the spending.
Yeah, they can hide their money and show that they're not earning anything. All their money's in a bank in the metaverse.
Yeah, it becomes very difficult to tax these folks, right? I mean, look at Donald Trump, how little he paid. I mean, I understand he's said to still be a billionaire.
Well, he says he is, and he's the best one there is.
Obviously, yeah. No, it's a difficult one. Though I've seen lots of conversations going on about it, but the 15% tax rate for corporations across the world, even though that's a few years in the making, but that's going to sort of even the playing field a little bit and stop people sort of putting money in different places. But the whole wealth, the inequality, that's the big issue that needs to be addressed. And if I was a billionaire, I don't know, I'd be like you look at how much Bill Gates invests of his personal income into things that he cares about. Yeah. If I was extremely wealthy, I'd probably want to be putting my money where I thought it needed to go versus relying on inefficient governments.
I get it. But there's I think the Singapore's actually got a good model, just the kind of indirect tax, right? So they tax very high tax on luxury goods, right? Very high tax on damaging goods, right? So very high tax, so-called sin items, right? So very high tax on cigarettes, alcohol. Very high tax on cars and particularly luxury cars. Relatively high stamp duty if you start, buying investment properties and so forth. So I think perhaps in Western countries they could look at that model to a greater extent, given how challenging it is to tax the super rich, given the ways that they can present their wealth, right, to get around. Some of the tax infrastructure and the regulations. And as you say, it's also not very popular. So increasing income tax, whoever it's on, is politically unpopular.
Yeah. What about you, Joe? What do you reckon?
Well, I've been thinking about it as soon as I heard about it and thought, isn't it kind of the obligation of the of companies and wealthy people to try and figure a way not to give it away, unwittingly, right? I mean, that's kind of how you get there in the first place. You figure out some good ways to amass wealth. You figure out good ways to get good returns. It's almost like you owe it to yourself to play the game some more, right? As in, if you get there and you can avoid it some way, you can figure something out. Like if you talked about the earnings, if you just taxed it directly and it's just on revenue, then that would be a simple thing. But we inadvertently give them rules that they can try and figure out ways around, right? So that's a game I can't resist playing. I mean, even though I'm not a billionaire, I choose to pay as little tax as I can.
Yeah.
Legally.
Yeah, but the mindset, it's for me, tax is always such an interesting thing, and it's a very emotional argument. Whenever I pay tax, I always say my tax is going towards supporting single mothers, because I think they have the hardest job in the world, and they're also the most criticized, by society. But I'm like, yeah, my tax is paying for them, but it's the obligation to each other. So if I was an American billionaire looking around my country, the infrastructure's a shambles, the education system's a shambles. Society is not operating at the standard it should be if it's the greatest country on earth. So contributing to society, the police force, the fire departments, all of that sort of stuff. It's on all of us to contribute. Whereas in Singapore, they kind of set up the system to do it for you, where they take care of all of that stuff. But in countries like America, which are crumbling, building bridges so kids
state by state, Andrea, though, right? So some states the infrastructure is better and they're higher tax states, and actually some low tax ones the infrastructure is quite good as well. It's unfair to just say some high tax ones the infrastructure is poor, right?
Yeah.
But it varies so much from place to place, and the same with the indirect tax. Like the state taxes are non-existent or very low in some places. I mean, I remember living in DC in the days when I smoked, and the cost of a packet of cigarettes in DC was something like $12. But if I just went over to Virginia, it was something like $3.50. So a bottle of my cigarettes in Virginia. So they have these, varying, tax regimes depending on where you are. But I'm all for more indirect. So just tax things like, so every time you buy a packet of cigarettes or a drink, you're paying tax, right?
Yeah.
Significant amount, a very high proportion of the cost of that beer or that packet of cigarettes is taxed. But having said that, cigarettes probably won't create much for much longer, given that it's a habit that seems to be dying out very rapidly.
Yeah. Well, then, Jeff Bezos's luxury yacht with the other yacht inside of it, right?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Like, incredible.
Yeah.
Anything to add on that one before we move on to COVID? No? All right. Couple of stories. I'll just go through them quickly. Brazil senators are backing criminal charges against Bolsonaro over the handling of COVID, and it includes 8 charges, and one is a crime against humanity. So they've put together a detailed report, which has been prepared for the case, and this has been handed to the chief prosecutor, who is a Bolsonaro appointee. So the chances of being charged are pretty much zero. And Bolsonaro, you have to remember, is the man who told Brazilians to stop whining about COVID. And this was a day after the country saw a record rise in deaths over a 24-hour period. So they've got a population of 208 million people, at least 606,000 deaths, second only to the US. And, of course, Trump conveyed his support for Bolsonaro after this announcement was made. Did you guys see that one?
Yep.
A populist leader.
I don't agree with that, actually. I don't agree. I mean, I don't like Bolsonaro one bit. I don't like what he said. But I don't think you should be prosecuting political leaders for making screw-ups over a virus that nobody predicted or had planned for, right? Regardless of their political position on it. Even though, I don't think it should have been politicized in the first place. Even though I think he's very, very wrong. That was his position on it. He was elected. If you don't, at the end of the day, if you disagree with his position on it in a democracy, vote him out. So hopefully Brazil will stay a democracy, so as that as possible. But I think prosecuting him is going a step too far. And I would they're not going to succeed, and his popularity has been impacted by this. So I figure ultimately that's the goal: getting another populist leader out, right? So it should be by the ballot box. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. Tim,
so it's a PR stunt from the opposition.
I don't know if it's actually the opposition. I think it's his own party as well. So there's it's a fairly comprehensive, it's like report that a lot of the current government are involved in. There's a lot of outrage in Brazil over his handling of COVID. So,
Yep.
Puerto Rico has officially become the most vaccinated place in America. So this is a country or a state that's been pummeled by deadly hurricanes, earthquakes, political unrest, and it's got incredible debt. So they know suffering, right? And as a result, they listened to the scientists. It never became a political issue, and they just got out there and got out into the community and got the vaccines into everybody's arms. So right now, they've got 73% of the population fully vaccinated. The closest state after that is Vermont, which has almost 71%. Two other big stories around COVID that broke this week. So Merck has agreed that it will sell its COVID pill with poor countries, and that looks like it's going to be moving quickly. So these are the pills that you take when you know you're sick before you go into hospital and you're on death's door. So that's some good news from a COVID perspective. And the other big breaking news was, of course, that Pfizer has been approved unanimously by the FDA. It's going to be officially approved possibly just after Halloween for children ages 5 to 11. I think that's going to get a lot of chatter, especially from parents. But one of the articles that I read this week that I thought was absolutely fantastic was one that Joe shared, and it talks about how Singapore fell victim to its own success, yet its worst killer is not COVID-19. I thought it was such a great article. Joe, do you want to just sort of give an overview of that one?
Now, I'm going to confess, when you mentioned this just before the show started, I went into a panic. It's almost as bad a panic as forgetting Andrew's surname. But it was, I was thinking to myself, I don't remember which article you're talking about. So
okay.
I'm not sure. Did I really say this? Because I've only had about 6 hours sleep over the past 5 days. So
no, fair
you
enough.
also owe me $20,000 you promised.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Send Andy Warhol some money.
This is the one that shows that people in Singapore who are, so it's vaccinated versus unvaccinated. So if you're unvaccinated, it's 11 times more, 11 times deadlier. But also the people who have been vaccinated, it was only single vaccines, not double, fully vaccinated.
I think what happens here is this. You're encountering what you call the Mandela effect, right? Because you saw a story that seemed to be the kind of story that I would have shared. So I'm very sure I didn't share that story, but it's the kind of story that I would share. And I've been getting on this whole thing about the statistics and the truth about vaccinations and stuff like that. So there've been some pretty good infographics of late. I can't claim to have shared that, although I'm very much. It's very much the kind of story that I would try to push forward. People aren't understanding the. I beg your pardon?
Let's talk about sleep deprivation and its impacts on memory and performance.
Yeah.
we could do that, but someone like myself, a 25-year-old, shouldn't look the way I do.
All right, so I've just noticed, very handsome. You mean those teeth aren't real? And Lavinia, I think I've just noticed their comments. They're all based on how handsome you were at the beginning there. So welcome. I'm presuming the Facebook user that we can't identify is Steve. He's a good husband. He watches every week. Yeah, no, you did share it, Joe. But anyway, it was a fantastic article. But what it did was, it was basically saying, I think there's 370 something deaths in Singapore. Does that sound right from COVID? Yeah. But if Singapore didn't follow its approach, there'd be anywhere between 12 and 15,000 deaths. And it shows just some really fantastic data compared to vaccinated and not vaccinated. The huge number of people in the population of Singapore that haven't been vaccinated, and what that means for the rest of the community. But while it looks like people are interpreting a lot of the data that's being presented as a failure, if you actually read this article and look between the lines, it's shown that Singapore has actually been a huge success. And the only country that's ahead of Singapore is New Zealand, but they're still closed off. And basically the message is you can't stay closed off forever. Singapore stays closed off for as long as it could. It's now opening up. Delta's in. Once it's in, it's in. But the numbers speak for themselves, and the government's done a good job. They're also saying Singapore's not the sort of government that they get on with doing the work rather than talking about the work. They're not looking for a pat on the back. They're looking to do the job right. So I thought, it was a really good article, and it sort of links to a few weeks of conversation we've been having is it the right approach? There's a lot of frustration in Singapore. So I think it was a good piece.
Yeah, I mean the approach seems to be, and I see this sort of rippling everywhere. It seems to be once you have the population fully vaccinated over 1%, whether that's 80 or 85 or 90 or whatever the percent is that they're choosing in that particular country or state, then things can open. And so Singapore's strategy obviously has been get as many people vaccinated as we possibly can, over 80, 85, 90% of the eligible population, and then let it in, which has been, and which is why we've got like over 5,000, cases now and stuff like that. And which basically means we're all going to get it. It's just going to be mild for most of us because we've had the jab. So, and then it's, sort of move on with your lives kind of thing. That seems to be the case. There are some technical, like Australia's opening up as well, but with those sorts of rules. So states can open once the population is got over 80-something% or 80% fully vaccinated in that particular state. Then it can open up for international travel starting again in November.
Yeah.
And so this seems to be happening everywhere. The challenge is that the existing technological infrastructure may not be able to cope, and the human call center style infrastructure may not be able to cope, let alone the hospital beds and ICUs should be able to a degree. I read that Singapore is converting the F1 pit lane building into a hospital, sort of temporary hospital as well. And so just to make sure that we've got more care facilities, and that is an existing building that's not being utilized.
So what percentage of ICU beds are taken up now? Do you guys know?
It happens to be that I produced the COVID-19 updates from Singapore, and I had called up two charts, which I thought at some point I'd be sharing with you. Yeah, I actually have the actual numbers. We're actually pretty good on ICU beds. There's like a national capacity of about 357 beds right now, and we have 72 beds empty. So that's the kind of headroom that we have. I would share the screen with you, but I'm not sure exactly what will happen to our screen as we do that. But the thing that we've been able to do here in Singapore is we've managed to keep enough headroom there in terms of number of beds available. But when you think about the actual number of beds empty right now, 72, and you think about a daily infection rate that has gone past 5,000, I think not enough people are feeling nervous about that. The people are getting too used to the idea that COVID is just everywhere. I always talk about when people go to the malls, you feel the malls are less crowded, but when you go around to the community centers and the areas around where we live, I'm not sure if it's the same for you as well, Tim, but down at the coffee shop and down at the places where everyone lives, apart from the masks, sometimes it's very hard to say that there is a pandemic. The behavior has become pre-pandemic again. We're careless. I think casually as well when we get together for I won't exactly say the circumstances that I've been recently, but I've been to a number of informal meetings where as soon as the doors were closed, the behavior became quite careless. No masks. Everyone was just interacting. Some people just don't even test. So it's that combination of stuff happening together, right? We have a high rate. The chances of meeting COVID actually is pretty high. If something bad happens, we do have some capacity left, but it's only 72 beds if you think about it in relation to everything. But based on the statistics and based on the science, though, it is pretty good because like 96% of the adult population is vaccinated, and they represent only 40% of the people requiring serious hospital care, and that's a very significant statistic.
And Joe, just to add, those people typically have comorbidities. It would be interesting to know how many vaccinated people require that kind of intensive care who've got no comorbidities. I think it's very low indeed.
Yeah, but one of the things about comorbidities is that we tend to discount a lot of things that we might not normally think about as comorbidities. Like just being fat is a comorbidity. You might have early stage diabetes too, and that might be seen as that as well.
Yeah,
So
good
yeah,
point.
it's true. If you have asthma, it makes you more susceptible, but it is still a factor, and I think people have to take that on board.
I mean, I was thinking of more severe ones. So I was thinking of the
Mm.
Colin Powell example. He had both Parkinson's and cancer, right?
Yeah.
So I wasn't thinking of, being overweight or defined as obese so much because, hey, probably 25-30% of the population is anyway, if not more. Or as you say, early stage diabetes. I was thinking, it'd be interesting to see those statistics in more detail. But the impression they give is that if you're vaccinated and you haven't got you're not working on another sickness that's quite severe, you're highly unlikely to require intensive care or oxygen.
The problem for me is I'm exposed to both sides of it, the COVID side of things and also the healthy longevity part of it, right? And there's a kind of a curve that happens about just general sickness general sickness, right? And as you get old, that all piles up. So that's why when we look at the deaths and the numbers in the higher age group, it's not just about the fact that they are older. It also means that they're much higher up along the curve of illnesses as well. So they're inherently going to have comorbidity built into it just because they're old,
Yeah.
Oh, the
huge
joys of
percentages.
aging.
Yeah, it's a fair point.
Yeah.
The older you get, the chances are you will have a comorbidity if you're, over the age of 75, a severe one, right? Rather than just being a bit plump.
Well, there's a big rush because I think someone mentioned the number, and I have to confirm that, but something like 70,000 people who are the most at risk, the older people, are not vaccinated, and that is actually the real danger because, as Tim mentioned, what's happening now is it's going to be just about everywhere. We've kind of prepared ourselves as much as we can, and now we're saying, okay, we're going to go to the next part of it and welcome the wave, and that's going to be reasonably, I won't say harmless, but it's not going to be as bad for most of us. But for those people who are in that higher age group and who are not vaccinated, then you've got that real double whammy coming on. They already would be susceptible, and now they have the additional, sort of the blast they'll get from Delta.
Wow. And then Delta Plus might make it in there, right? Yeah. Okay. So we watch and wait. It's always been a long-term story. All right, shall we move into the environment? So the show has begun in the US Congress. So major US oil companies are being quizzed. One of the Democratic representatives, Ro Khanna, said the idea is for them to admit to the American people what they have done. It's kind of like the tobacco industry when they were so honest in admitting that cancer. Cigarette harms people. But anyway, a statement by the committee said the industry had known about the effects of global warming since 1977, but for decades spread denial and doubt about the harm of its products. So one to watch. My hope is not high. Another one is 10 of the world's most protected forests have become net emitters of carbon as they are degraded by human activity and climate change. So these are forests that are protected by the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, or they are part of that. And it just shows that even the most protected, the most funded sites are still can't escape. One good piece out of the Biden plan is that they're expecting to contribute at least $500 billion to climate change. So they are dropping other things like parental leave. We've obviously seen individual senators basically stopping progress on critical things, but it looks like they're absolutely committed to climate change action. So let's say that I saw just before we got on the call that Biden's arrived in Europe without an agreement. Australia has been in the media and has been mocked all week. Have you guys seen that? And this is basically following its weak commitment to change before COP26. I felt so proud to be Australian. But one of the things that Australia has not addressed, and it will never, I can't imagine it will address while ScoMo's still in power, is its biggest contribution to climate change isn't what happens in Australia, but due to its fossil fuel exports.
Yeah.
So basically, it's time to measure that, and it's time to put that measurement on the countries who are selling it. And if you look at countries like Norway, who's always at the top of the green lists, well, if they factor in their oil exports, they'll be pretty low down on the list too. So not a proud week to be Australian, Andy.
Now, again, this is where this whole indirect taxation approach. You just tax these guys, tax them more, make people pay way more for using, non-renewable fuels, subsidize people for using the renewable. Just change the regulatory environment, just change the rules of the game a little bit. And it shouldn't be rocket science to do that. It really shouldn't. I think the problem is there was a time when they did make those changes. I mean, I remember growing up, because it's interesting you say we've known about, I remember learning about global warming when I was about 10 years old, and I don't want to give away my age too much, but, it was a long time ago, right? Not long after the date you just mentioned. So we've known about it for a long time. And I remember in the 80s, there was a lot of government action to get rid of, for lead-free petrol, the ozone layer, getting rid of CFCs and so on. And it was relatively easy to do then. To try and green issues were big on the agenda, even of right-wing governments then. The British Conservative Party were big on it. It was a big, right? And the Green parties were big all over Europe. In the Democrats, I think even the Republicans, took it on board at one point. And I think what made it easier for them is that at that time, about 85% of the world's GDP and economic activity was just North America, Western Europe, and Japan. I think the problem is just saying to emerging countries, sorry, you can't do what we've done. And these markets, as these countries, emit so much more because they've got 1 billion people rather than, say, what the UK would have had when it was a particularly bad emitter, 30, 40 million people at the 1900 when it was the biggest emitter. So the scale of what you're dealing with has changed. And it's very hard to persuade, people in developing countries to do this. And you will have politicians in Western countries who will say, well, we don't want to be at a competitive disadvantage against China or India, who don't have to worry about these regulations that we do. So in my view, there's been almost no progress since the early 1990s. And we've known it all since the late 70s. Yeah. It's been something with we've known the scientists, the oil companies, whoever, everybody who just reads a book, just studies geography, or, you understand it. We've known it for a long, long time, and I just don't think there's been any progress in about 30 years. And it's a lot of it is to do with there are great benefits of globalization, but it's to do with this very rapid globalization, this very rapid economic development in countries with huge populations.
Yeah, especially in the last decade, right? So the emerging middle class went from, I think it was 500 million in 2013, and it's estimated to hit 1.75 billion by 2020. So that's a Kishore Mahbani statement. And, I don't think there's enough conversation about that. But you were talking about renewables and taxing the fossil fuel versus the renewables. But I think a lot of people don't actually, like solar panels in China, right? They're made, they're still produced with emissions because all the energies come from coal and that sort of stuff. So it's even then it's not a clear-cut thing. And
that's a fair point.
And the fossil fuel industry is so intertwined in so many layers of society and governance and states, and it's an insidious thing within our global society. So it's about getting it out. If they had have said in 77, right, well, we better sort this out because by 2020 we're going to be on a road to catastrophe, but they could have gradually worked it out, and but we didn't have that. They didn't do it, so now it's this sudden shift that we have to make, and so the choice is economic devastation now or economic devastation whenever the worst of it starts to hit.
We're not paying for the damage. It's not factored into the way we behave and pay for things. So, for example, palm oil, right? So that's in pretty much all the ridiculously cheap goods, but you should pay a lot more given the amount of damage that palm oil plantations cause. You should pay way more for those products. Yeah, so it somehow needs to be I mean, that's just an example. Yeah. But it somehow needs to be factored in. And as you say, if producing these solar panels, again, people have talked about carbon taxes and so on, paying more for it. If it is costing a lot in terms of carbon emissions, then you should pay for it. Whoever's buying them should pay for that. There should be a price on the damage, on those externalities.
Yeah, but eventually the price doesn't really matter, right? Like an electric vehicle, that's great, but it takes you at least, I think it's 7 years before you counter out the emissions that were put into the creation of the vehicle. So
it can drive behavior. Like, for example, let's say the price of petrol in Singapore went up 10 times. People would use public transport more.
Yeah. So there you go.
Well,
it would drive behavior.
That
and it's already the most...
that particular argument to me always bugged me, about how pricing works, right? There is pricing, and then there is in the face of pricing, there is human behavior in terms of desire. I mean, the price of cars in Singapore should necessarily mean we don't drive. To have a vehicle, if you were to take that same analogy back into time, is that people would be, you have to choose between buying 2 horses and having a house. But we're perfectly happy to have a horse because it's convenient, right? And if we have a bit more money, we'll buy 2 horses, which add up to more than the price of my house. It's a very bad analogy right now, but there is this thing about how much, I think in the end we also have to factor in the actual value of something. So cars continue to be expensive here because they have their value. They really provide you that convenience which you're willing enough to pay for, whether it's convenience, whether it's status, whatever it is, that value is enough for you to exchange something for it. So what we really need to do is work on changing value. Value is something which is perceived, and we need to knock it down and make it a highly distasteful thing to own.
That's more cultural. I mean, price, I think, is one tool. I'm not saying it's the only tool. I think it's one tool that you can use. But to your point about Singapore and the price of cars, if you look at Singapore, I mean, a friend of mine was telling me how he was talking to a colleague in Jakarta, and the colleague saw, I think, Anson Road behind him, and like 2 or 3 cars just going down the road, compared to what you would see out the window in Jakarta. And it's not just the population; it's the cost of motoring is way lower, right? In a lot of parts of the world, and the congestion is just awful, almost unbearable.
So I think in Singapore, for that congestion though must be massive.
But Joe's point.
Was that your point? Was your point about just there's congestion in Jakarta, there isn't congestion in Singapore?
My point is that that people don't drive as much in places where cars are very expensive, right? So a lot of people just don't. I know a lot of people. I mean, I know a lot of people who haven't, but I know a lot of people who would have a car if they lived in Australia who don't have a car in Singapore. They just think it's not worth $100,000 or whatever.
That's exactly me.
So I think it is, So I think it does take a lot of cars off the road, that policy that they have in Singapore.
Yep.
And it is rare. I mean, I'm not saying there are no traffic jams. There are some, but the traffic jams are nothing compared to what I've experienced in every other city I've visited or been in.
Yep.
It's one of the great things about Singapore.
Yep.
I mean, I'm a bit selfish. I do have a car, and I love the fact that I don't run into these traffic jams to the same degree, and I can park very easily for $3-4, where it would cost me like $80 in the center of Sydney or somewhere.
Yeah. So this is the amazing thing, right? So we amongst us, we know roughly what the price of a car is or the vehicle is, right? So how many vehicles do you think there are in Singapore, given that we have a population of about, let's say, under 5 million, and cars are very expensive?
I don't know. I know it's high. I know the idea of,
because it's almost 1 million. We have almost 1 million vehicles, 974,000 motor vehicles. There is a bit more to it than just that it's easy to drive around Singapore. I mean, we do have good systems in place. It makes it very viable to have. It is just too easy and just too good to have a car. That's really it. I mean, that's why it's still the valuable thing it is, right? So if we had more traffic, I don't know, maybe it would be less worthwhile.
Yeah, but I think cars are slightly. I think if we go back to solar panels, or if you go to oil versus wind, for example, I think that's probably because it's the same outcome, except one of them is being subsidized like crazy, that's causing all the problem, and the other one isn't being subsidized enough. And And what Andrew was saying before is if we actually just took that subsidy from this one and put it over to that one, that would change the pricing and it would change the behavior. Whereas everyone would still have a car. Everyone who wants a car has a car. I don't have a car because exactly what Andrew said. I don't see the value. In Australia, there's the car is cheaper, but the distance is far greater. And that's the big difference. If you want to get out to the farm or you want to get up to see to go and visit somewhere else or whatever, you're not going to wait 2.5 hours for a train to turn up. You're going to just get in the car and go. And we need that sort of mobility, whereas Singapore absolutely don't need it. You might that might change a little bit once you get over 2 children. Once you get past the 2 children mark, then the economics may change. Possibly with the 2 children. But there's a lot happening here. So Singapore's very different from the car side, but I do think pricing makes a big difference when it comes to subsidies and and behavior of what we choose based on those subsidies.
Because I mean, I totally agree with you. But Joe, as a Singapore, I mean, as a company, I guess I've been here for 10 years now. But one of the things that I did think was good about the government approach was the fact that they invest in this brilliant public transport at a phenomenally low price that anyone can use. Right, it's clean, comfortable, efficient, remarkably cheap. Right, unlike any other city in the world I've lived in, where it's kind of a bit shabby and often overpriced. And the cost of motoring is very high, taking a lot of cars that might otherwise be on the road off the road. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's demand inelastic, as I guess what you were suggesting, that people will pay whatever price is necessary to have a car. But the sense I get is it's actually quite a green policy to discourage driving and encourage public transport.
We basically just put a quota on the number of cars, so we limited the supply part. And actually, the reason why the cars are expensive is demand. So like one of the things that was mentioned at the conference we were at is that it always comes down to human failure, right? So we reduced the number of vehicles we could put out there, but it's that human behavior that still desires the car, the vehicle that bids the price up. And it's not everyone who buys a car in Singapore who's wealthy. There are quite a lot of people who buy cars who should have no business buying cars. It's just not economically not a good idea.
That's an interesting point. Just couple, one quick one long one. Okay, so the first one is a report came out in the ABC that the Australian wine industry is actually moving south. So basically, a lot of the major wineries. So I grew up just near Brown Brothers in country Victoria, and they're now relocating to Tasmania. And they're expecting in the future that your bubbles will not come from France, but they'll come from Tassie. So I thought that was a really interesting one. You don't really care so much anymore, Tim, because you're not drinking wine anymore. But I thought that was interesting. But one of the articles I really, really want to encourage everyone to read is in phys.org, which is a really good site. And it's basically titled "Climate Scientists Fear Tipping Points. Maybe You Should Too." And this is an article that really explores, Earth's where it's this complex interlocking climate system where when one thing goes, another thing will be impacted. So obviously we've talked about permafrost before, but basically in the permafrost right now is 2 times the amount of carbon that's currently in the atmosphere locked into the permafrost. So if the permafrost melts, we've got 2 times more carbon coming out, right, than what we've already got in the atmosphere. So it's a big thing. And when you look at
and methane.
Obviously methane's a big part of it. To understand the tipping points, you've got to go really big pictures because it's things like the monsoon system, ocean circulation, the jet stream, and then, of course, the big ecosystems. And because they're all interlinked, and if any one of them breaks, and, we've talked about the AOC, which is the current that comes through down America, and that sort of pushes warm water this way or warm water that way. So these are important. So if any of these sort of fall over, we've got abrupt change, and this is the crisis. So there are 15 significant tipping points, and those least resistant to global warming, and also closest to the point of no return, are the tropical coral reefs. So I was just snorkeling on some coral reefs just this week. The West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, alpine glaciers. So if you want to go skiing in the alpine region, you should probably get your boots on. Arctic summer sea ice and the Amazon forest, which if it passes the tipping point, which a couple of years ago an expert said it already had, it's going to be a savanna. And so, we've talked about that before, that it all sort of links up, and that's global. It sort of manages global weather patterns. So the core point here is we have absolutely no time to lose. And if you read a lot of the stuff that's coming out around COP26, I'm not feeling very hopeful. I'm not at the moment. I'd like to be, but I'm not from what I'm reading. So pay attention to it. Read this article. Read the other articles too. So that's the environment for today.
I feel miserable.
Yeah. I was going to say, I was trying to think about what can we do about this right now, and I think the only thing that there is to do really is to keep talking about it, to keep putting it out there, and to do it in such a way that you don't seem like the crazy person. I think one of the problems that comes along with this is that there is an increasing desperation about the story, and there's a nature about us that doesn't want to listen to desperate people. As desperate people are saying what they say, we tend to put a bit of space between ourselves and them. We need to be able to teach people to speak about it, so that we don't sound desperate and we don't sound on the fringe. So that you got me feeling really depressed. I really didn't know what to say with that.
Well, I got some cheerful news. So we've got our End of the World is Nigh sandwich board on, but underneath that we're all wearing Spanx. Did you hear about the nice gesture from Sarah Blakely, the founder and CEO of Spanx? So they just did a VC deal, I think, with not BlackRock, but Blackstone, or some partnership with Blackstone, and which ended up valuing Spanx at $1.2 billion. So she had 500 of staff in the room. She did a bit of an Oprah, where she thanked them all and did a sort of Champers cheers, possibly bubbly from Tassie, probably Napa, but Champers cheers to all the women in the world that didn't have the opportunities that had, even in thinking about a mother and her grandmothers, that didn't quite have the opportunities that she had. And then she made a comment about how women are underrepresented in VC funding, and why that's not right based on the number of women entrepreneurs that are out there and how their ideas can make a real difference. And then she went over to this little globe and started spinning it around and go, why I'm spinning this globe around? It's because to thank everybody for what they've done and for what's just happened, I bought each one of you 2 first-class tickets to anywhere in the world, which might have an environmental problem. But she bought 2 first-class tickets to everywhere in the world. And while you're there, you might need to go to a nice restaurant and spend some money. So you're all getting $10,000 cash each as well. And they all were just like, woohoo, which is really a nice feel-good thing.
Yeah.
Fling off the sandwich board, have your curve wear happening, and enjoy salsa in Rio before it becomes a savanna.
Yeah, well, exactly right. Or come to Thailand and spend some money. The people need it, and many other countries around the world. All right, shall we move on to our theme this week, which is cybersecurity, why it's hot and why you should care. So it's actually Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which I didn't realize. But we're really, I'm excited to hear Andrew's thoughts. I've got a lot of respect for Andrew's opinions. But in case you haven't been paying attention, cybersecurity has definitely been a hot issue in the last couple of years, especially during the pandemic. I mean, it's always an important issue. But it's something that's just today. I just read a Thai hotel group has been had a cybersecurity attack, and all the information's been stolen. But it's become hotter. So, Andy, why is it important? Why now? Why should we care?
Well, you don't have to care.
Teach us.
I mean, you don't have to care. It's a risk appetite issue, really. So it's all a risk game. So some folks say, well, I don't really care. I'm willing to take the risk of depending whether you're a company or a private individual. But let's just assume you're a company. Some companies might say, well, look, we're willing to take bigger risks. We don't want to invest in all these controls and all these people and change all these policies. Whereas other organizations are willing to, are less willing to take risks, and there may be regulatory or compliance reasons why they have to do it. But why is it such a big deal now? right? So why are people more concerned about it now? Well, partly because the risk of actually being attacked and the impact of those attacks is much higher than ever before. And this is becoming more severe just because we use more technology. It's as simple as that. Technology is actually the problem. Right? So the more we do the kind of thing we're doing now, the more we shop online, the more we collaborate using this kind of technology, the more we use cloud, the more we work from home, the bigger the so-called attack surface. So the more opportunities we're offering the threat actors. And at the same time, those threat actors are becoming way, way more sophisticated. And again, the technology we're using is giving them more opportunities to do all kinds of cunning things. But, just to say something a little bit, to really cut to the chase, you or I, just in a very, very short period of time, could launch a sophisticated cyber attack that could potentially cause very severe damage in 24 hours, because you can go onto the dark web and without much technical knowledge, you can buy ransomware as a service kits or DDoS, distributed denial of service kits, and you could get a friend, maybe you could pay someone in an organization just to unleash it there, or you could just send out loads of emails to everybody in this organization, get basically phishing emails, right? And the chances are someone will fall for it, if you do enough. So it's not that hard. You don't even need to be technical to launch one of these attacks. And because organizations are using more technology, they're transitioning, they're going through, what we describe as digital transformation. Often that's very centered around the cloud. They're so focused on getting everything done that they're not really thinking about their cyber security posture, so to speak. So they often have what we call in the industry controls. So they don't have controls that are really fit for purpose for the new way they do business and operate. And again, as everybody's working from home and rushing into using the cloud more and more, chances are whatever organization's encouraging you to do that has not switched its controls or cybersecurity posture. And this cybersecurity posture is not just technology. I mean, when you look at cybersecurity, it's all about thinking, what is it you're trying to do? So you have to think about policies first, and then you buy technology that enables you to enforce and implement those policies. A lot of people think, you just buy this technology and plug it in, that'll sort it out. You have to sit and think what it is you want to do, and then you look for the technology that does that, and typically it'll be there. And then you ask someone to help you. Again, I'm talking about it from a company perspective. From an individual, private perspective, I guess, people aren't as bothered because they don't feel they've got as much to lose. And the banks, when we do banking, typically the banks take responsibility for online fraud, not us. So if somebody manages to get our passwords, whatever it might be, we're not typically too worried about that. The threat that what happens to us is more a case of people getting our data, harvesting our data from our devices, and it might not seem worth much, but your data on the dark web might be worth a couple of dollars, and if you multiply this by 1 million people's, it's worth quite a lot. And that data helps certain organizations get a better picture of who's doing what, where they are, and so on. So your data that somebody has got is probably floating around somewhere. And then there's the other big one we touched upon, which is these big misinformation campaigns that are directed at ordinary individuals, and very often nation state actors are behind those, or groups with perhaps a political agenda.
So there used to be so statistically the chances of being personally attacked used to be more towards men than females, because the cyber attackers tend to be more males, so they go after males because then they could sort of represent themselves as a man if, say, they got a phone call or something and they had a male voice. Is that still the same, or has that changed?
I think, look, I mean, I haven't seen that particular piece of research, but I think if you're looking at companies, I don't think it discriminates. So very often to try to get into the company, you might do what they call business email compromise. So have an email that looks like it's from the HR department, the finance department, your boss, and they send it out in the hope that just one person will think, I'd better pay that invoice, or I'd better respond to my boss. I better click on that link my boss has sent me, right? So just one person has to do that. And it's hard to say at the moment whether males or females are more likely to fall for that. I guess it would depend on what you're trying to do as well, right? I mean, obviously, if you're trying to do something, I mean, I can't think off the top of my head, but
it's like credit card fraud. Oh, God, I can't speak. Credit card fraud. That's actually quite hard to say.
It's a good product to think about as well, the credit crab.
But that was one of the examples where men were more attacked than females. But one of the things that you were talking about, so you said banks tend to take on the risk, whereas in Australia, they don't necessarily take on the risk. If you don't do the bare minimum of keeping your account secure, fraud detectives will take your computer and do an analysis of it. And then if you're responsible, you actually take the cut. That's some of my friends have experienced that in Australia.
I mean, is that online if someone gets into your account and moves money around online? Pretending to be you?
Presuming so, yeah. Yeah, basically,
I think the bank would take responsibility for that. If somebody's stolen your identity and gone in, that's something I was talking to one of the delegates yesterday at Connect Gov about, and he was saying the big issue is our customers. Our customers are a huge vulnerability for us. And the regulator and the Singapore consumer protection is certainly weaker here than in Australia, here in Singapore than in Australia. And he was saying that the regulator wouldn't allow them to make the customers accountable for fraud. I mean, you'd have to do something very, very blatant. I think they'd have to prove that you'd
writing your PIN number,
or you'd colluded, or you'd done it intentionally. It would be very difficult.
Or not having security software.
You can't hold some old lady accountable, right? For sorry to stereotype the gender, but most people aren't very technically savvy in the first place. You can't hold them accountable for somebody managing to get into their bank account and stealing money. You'd have to prove collusion or intent of some sort. I mean, I know with credit cards, I've had a few issues just with physical credit cards here where somebody's run my credit card through, and I've had real trouble getting the money back, and the bank certainly has tried to suggest that I'd somehow been irresponsible in that occurring. But I think in the online world, it's very, very difficult indeed to put it onto the customer.
So one of the other issues with cybercrime was, especially for the big organizations like the banks, is they would get an attack and they wouldn't necessarily communicate honestly that what had happened because they didn't really want that attention. And of course, they can get huge fines from governments if the data is breached. But the other thing is they weren't talking to each other. So that they'd come in and attack one, then they'd attack the next one, they'd attack the next one. But because they didn't talk, they weren't sharing information, it actually was making the situation worse. Have they changed? Have they started to talk to each other?
You're asking a lot of questions we discussed, Joe. I don't know if you remember the conversations we were having in some of the panels, right? But this was one of the things that came up. So I know that Singapore, the Singapore government is actually proactively looking at ways to make sure that this information is being shared, at least by industry. So when there is an attack that hits one organization, other organizations are made aware of it. So this is actually one of the ways that the industry is starting to evolve to do that, because you're right. It's they go to one bank, they do it to that one, then they go to another one, the same thing happens. I think collaboration in that way and sharing threat information is a big issue today, and it's something that there's a whole bunch of organizations out there saying that we can work with you to enable that and support it, and the government agencies are working closely with industry on that at the moment.
So
the organization or the conference that we're at, should I add on to it there, and Andy, why that kind of a meeting is so good? Because it's a meeting of CIOs, is that it kind of normalizes some of these things that people are embarrassed about. So because they realize that, you're getting this problem too, or we're experiencing the same kind of thing as well, we can talk more about these things, and so you can talk about it. It's just like the early days. I mean, it used to be with other kinds of personal attacks that were a bit more embarrassing. People wouldn't talk about it, so you always felt that you were the only one. That also is a significant part of it. So it's kind of linked to what Kathy was talking about a couple of shows ago. This thing about being able to just have those conversations, to be authentic, to discuss what is a common problem, so that you can find a better solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair point. So there's a lot of attacks that will take place, and even though they really should share that information and collaborate, for whatever reason they'll keep quiet, because there's also the legal risks. A lot of organizations will want to investigate it, check their liability, check what the impact might be on their reputation. do a detailed investigation of the attack to find out what, if any, data has leaked. And you won't necessarily want to go, hey, I've just been attacked and so on, and share that information with everybody until you've really done an in-depth investigation. Although regulators are starting to say that if you have had a breach and you discover it, you've got to inform the regulator within 72 hours in a lot of jurisdictions. MAS here in Singapore requires that, for example.
So the regulators are the attack police, are they?
Well, the regulator wants to make sure that, if something like this happens, obviously the people that might be impacted by it are sufficiently well protected. So they want to make sure that, that for example, if there has been an attack on a financial services organization, that the financial services organization is doing absolutely everything it can to, say, protect the data of its customers, right? So, and somewhere like Singapore, financial services hub, that's super important. A lot of other places, I don't think Australia is as strict, by the way, on notification. It's not as the pressure is not as intense, but the financial services sector in Singapore has a lot of pressure on it to do this.
So when you hear about, in America, some of my friends have had their identity stolen, and it takes them years and years and years to recover from that. And I haven't seen that same extent of that out in other parts of the world. I mean, is it becoming more of an issue that if your data does? Because I mean, this hotel, that chain that got attacked today, that I heard about today, they've got copies of your passport, they've obviously got copies of your credit card, name, address, everything, right? That's a lot of important information to be out there in the world. I mean, you can't. You have to trust these chains to protect that information. And if they've been attacked,
so it's a great point. Great point. I mean, I was teaching, by the way, at a university here, so ESSEC. I taught the master's students a cybersecurity course, and one of the questions I asked them at the beginning was, I said, "What is identity?" Because back in the day, your identity, throughout most of human existence, your identity was your family name, your physical appearance, the town you lived in, and that was really it, right? And just over the last 100 years or so, in fact, it's accelerated in the last 20 just think how many 20 or 30 years, how many elements there are, how many identity attributes we have, right? And when you look at digital identity, a lot of those traditional forms, which might even just be, you might see someone in your town and realize it's not them by their gait, for example, the way they walk. Well, those kinds of ways of identifying somebody have gone, or even the tone of voice or the time of day they're doing something. So a whole new set of attributes have suddenly appeared, a load of kinds of attributes that you can set up, or digital identities that you can create, different passwords and so on, email addresses, whole varieties of it. I'm getting somewhat distracted by the teeth up there, but a whole variety of different kinds of identity attributes. Now, what the bad actors want to do is steal as many of these as possible to create fake identities. Some of these fake identities might be what are known as synthetic identities, which is made, or Frankenstein identities, which is made up of, say, your email address, Andrea, my mobile phone number, a couple of passwords of Joe's, right? Sorry, and a name possibly. Tim's name, right? Possibly. And then that is used to create some sort of false identity to set up, bank accounts or whatever it might be for nefarious purposes. But you're right. I know in the US, when people have issues with identity theft, it's often a very big deal to address it. But identity is a really big deal. Protecting that identity and even defining what it is a big issue in the cybersecurity world.
So I got a couple of questions.
Me too, but you go.
Okay, I got a couple of questions. So apart from identity theft, what would you say the big three trends that we kind of need to look out for?
Well, I think, so the big one at the moment is we're being bombarded with ransomware, right? So that's one that's I mean, probably, I didn't see your Thai example you gave, Andrea, but I know a lot of Thai hospitals and schools have been hit with ransomware fairly recently over the last year or two. But ransomware is just becoming a bigger and bigger problem because it's easier and it's lucrative. So the risk of doing it the risk-reward ratio benefits the attacker enormously. So we're just seeing so many more ransomware attacks, and organizations need to put plans in place to identify it as soon as it comes in. And there's technology you can use that can potentially detect it. Have backups in place. So as what the ransomware usually does is it will find a way of encrypting your data, so as you can't use it without paying the ransom, and then be given a key to unlock that data. So other forms of protection you can use against that is to have backup that's immutable, that can't be touched. The cunning ransomware players often try and go for your backup as well, but there's a complex set of ways of dealing with it. But we're going to see more and more of this ransomware. Identity and access management are a huge one. So just finding ways, and you will see it when you deal with your banks more and more. So not just using biometrics to a greater degree and throwing passwords out the window, just finding other ways of validating your identity. But when you have access, minimizing it, not allowing you to have access for too long. So if a bad actor does get in, there's less that they can actually do. So a lot of what people are doing with cybersecurity today to deal with the problems is accepting there will be a breach, right? This is an important concept to get across. Accepting there will be breaches, but just trying to make it as difficult as possible for them to do damage once they get in, and making it minimal. So the banks will have calculations saying, we accept there will be some breaches, we accept there'll be this amount of fraud, and we'll lose potentially this amount of money, but we're going to put these controls in place just to try to make sure that should someone get in, there's only so far they can get to, because we'll have all kinds of AI and ML techniques looking at the movement and what's going on in our systems and networks, and just minimizing what can be done, and putting up red flags if there's anything peculiar going on.
What's ML?
Oh, sorry, machine learning. So I shouldn't use the jargon too much. Yeah, machine learning.
So ransomware, access management.
Okay, so if you said what are the three things, all right. So I would say, ransomware is a big deal. Tightly controlling identity and access management is another big one, and phishing is still huge. So what there's social engineering. So me basically going out and doing a bit of research on you, Tim, and then pretending to be, your accountant, right? As a way of getting to you. So social engineering turning into phishing. It could be voice or SMS I try to get you through, or WhatsApp I try to get you through, or a traditional email approach. So that's still growing. That social engineering stroke phishing is growing as a kind of way of getting in and launching other attacks. So I would say certainly ransomware will see the scale, the number of ransomware attacks and the size of them increasing. We'll see a lot more focus on identity, on managing our identities, and it's going to impact us as regular, ordinary mortals.
Yeah.
So those, and we'll see a lot more focus on, I guess, training and awareness to make people aware of these kinds of phishing attacks and what to look out for. I mean, I've done these myself, and these phishing tests, and I always fall for one or two of them. There are phishing tests you can do online.
Yeah. Yeah. So God, there's so many questions. So one of the projects I remember doing with Experian was changing regular behavior is an important part, right, for business and for individuals. So every Friday in the UK, when you bought a house, every Friday you transferred the money and pay for it. So basically, there were all these people out there with fake email addresses getting in and getting that money. So a person's entire life saving would be transferred to buy a house, but it would never go to where it needed to go. So they basically lost everything. And it was a predictable behavior that, the cyber criminals.
Man in the middle attack, that would be.
Yeah, right.
It does.
But cyber warfare is another thing, right? So a few weeks ago, one of the most senior North Korean Secret Service people was interviewed on the BBC, and he was talking about the technology infrastructure that North Korea has in place, and apparently they're doing all sorts of spying and cyber warfare, and and who knows, is it true? Is it not? Do we know? What's going on that side,
true.
right?
It's true.
Yeah,
look,
right.
if you're North Korea, we saw it with the Sony attack in 2013. I don't know if you guys remember that, but they destroyed Sony pretty much because of that.
And it was definitely them.
The interview. Yeah. No, it was. Unless you don't believe what has been. But yeah, I mean, they had the motive. They went on about it, right? So there's no reason to think it was anybody else that did it, right, at the time.
Well, there's one big IT guy who pressed the wrong button that day and just said, "Yeah, it was them."
Possibly, but I mean, there's enough evidence out there to suggest that so the US, for example, right? It's military and economic and arguably political power is kind of outstrips the power of China or Russia or North Korea. And then we talked a bit about authoritarian regimes and the so-called democratic world. And one of the ways that they can take on the United States in a kind of asymmetric conflict is through cyber attacks, right? And they can find a way of really. I mean, there's been some recent attacks, for example. I don't know if you remember a few months ago on an oil pipeline, Colonial. So some critical infrastructure on a food processor as well. So the food supply chain, these attackers were getting to, and the United States. I mean, they did say. I mean, I have no reason to disbelieve some of these guys because they're fairly transparent about it anyway. I mean, you can look into it in a lot of detail, but they did trace it to a nation state actor. Right, all of those attacks. So what we're seeing is that a place like North Korea, but China, Russia too, Iran, and the West can do it as well, right? So Israel and the United States can do it the other way around. So it's a bit unfair to say it's just these guys, but these guys can have a bigger punch, right, in this cyber world than they could potentially have in a kind of military conflict. Let's say, actually that's arguable these days as well. But they can have quite a powerful impact just by cyber attacks on critical infrastructure or misinformation. So again, a lot of people believe that what got Trump into power was misinformation coming from a particular state. What caused Brexit to happen was misinformation from a particular country. What is making the COVID epidemic so much worse is misinformation from certain authoritarian regimes. They just want chaos. They thrive in chaos. They thrive in being able to say we're the only ones who can deal with this.
It's such an important point. And it's why I was having not an argument because I don't really argue on Twitter, but I said, we're already in World War III. We've been in World War III for 20 years. And they're like, what the hell are you talking about? And I'm like, cyber. I'm like, go and have a look, right? And we're so sucked in by the storyline that we're being fed, and it's fabricated by people who are doing, as you're saying, creating chaos, right? And they're succeeding. And I think it's because we can't understand why anyone would be motivated to do something like that, because it's not necessarily like every time Russia's blamed, I don't necessarily think it's Putin and his guys, but I do think it's a group of really smart people that are sitting there having a bit of fun, and we can't understand what's going on in their mind to do something like that. Like, why would you, right? But
that's a good point. I mean, in Russia, a lot of the ransomware attacks that come out of Russia are known groups, right? Or it's traced to a group, and they're outside of the long arm of the US law. They can't extradite them. And the common view is that, Putin and the Russian authorities won't necessarily be sitting there saying, hey guys, do this ransomware attack, but they're not doing anything to stop it.
Yeah.
And they're not doing anything to help the American authorities when the American authorities are not just the American ones, they're Western world authorities, say to Russia, hey, can you please do something to stop this? It's giving us a headache. So that's the sense of what's going on out of Russia to an extent. And yes, then there's misinformation campaigns around election times and votes and so on. And that's something that, that I guess during the Cold War went on as well, but it wasn't as easy for them to do. Right? They used other means to try to spread misinformation. And China and North Korea, they kind of can take a whole of state approach to the activities that they get involved in, right? They can use all of the organizations in their countries to work with them on their agenda, which the United States get a disadvantage there because quite often it's at loggerheads with, say, Facebook or Cisco or Microsoft. They're not part of government the way, say, I know you can say it clearly now, it's very clear that Huawei, despite denials, is part of government in China.
Yeah.
Given what we've seen in the news recently. It's kind of reinforced that.
Tim, do you want to ask something? We'll wrap it up, but do you want to ask something?
Well, okay, then my question would have to be scaled down, but my My question was going to be, okay, you said there's ransomware, access management, and phishing being the three big things, and rather than leave everybody in a sort of scared, dark world, what are three things that corporates can do? Having heard this, if somebody's listening, they're going, okay, well, yeah, we need to do something else, or medium businesses, what can they do, and what are three things that individuals can do? And it doesn't have to be three if we don't have time, but you know,
I was going to do the individual thing too.
I mean, it's not that scary. Again, as I said to start with, it's to do with risk appetite, how much risk you're willing to bear, right? So some people may just say, well, look, I'm fine with this. I'm willing to just continue my life as normal, and I'll just wait until something happens, and I'll cross that bridge when it comes. But you know, there are kind of hygiene practices that you need to think about. Like, for example, when we talk about identity and access management, there's a principle people talk about in cybersecurity called least privilege. And what that means is you give the least access for the smallest amount of time to anyone who's accessing your resources. And that applies particularly to people with a lot of privileges, like CEOs or heads of IT, who, for example, often can access all the systems and so on. And the reason that's such a big risk is when that hacker inevitably gets in and they get the passwords and the credentials of the CEO or the IT admin people, they can move around freely. So what least privilege says is you just really restrict the access you give, and that's quite a straightforward one to do. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and you also do very, very basic access controls that often are built in and are free with a lot of the software we use, like MFA, right, multi-factor authentication, which reduces the chances of somebody getting through, many times, right? So these are some kind of top of mind corporate approaches, training and education, and we talk about that all the time. We just need to continue on these awareness campaigns. The younger generation are more aware, but we just need to continue with these awareness campaigns from a corporate perspective. As we move to cloud, a lot of people just rush in and they think about security later, and they don't want to get too technical, configure the cloud properly. It's misconfigured in a way that makes it more open for people to get into than when it was on premise, which is not supposed to be the case. Just knowing what your exposure is. Here's a nice little anecdote for you. I spoke to somebody recently who was telling me that his organization does these vulnerability assessments, just very simple, to try to identify what their vulnerabilities are. So this is openness is something that's important here. And he says that the vulnerability assessment will come back from one country saying, hey, we've got these vulnerabilities. Then it'll come back from several countries saying, oh, we have none. And he doesn't believe it. He says they're doing that just because they don't want the extra work and they don't want to be blamed. They don't want to be blamed for that vulnerability. Yeah. So there's big issues around visibility as well, right? And this is at a corporate level. I mean, I could go on to a whole bunch of other ones, but those are some of the really, really big ones at a corporate level.
So that's in the same company, but in different countries.
Yeah, but it could be in the same country. It doesn't matter. I mean, the point he's making is that you don't necessarily get the truth, right? When you ask someone to go and do something, how do you know, right? And often people have other motives. They might think, well, if I admit to this vulnerability, I'm going to be working, 16-hour days for the next 2 years, right? So maybe I just cover it up and get another job somewhere. Or maybe or somebody might be worried that they'll be blamed for it. Right?
Okay.
So
what about as individuals?
Well, pardon?
As individuals, what's the essentials? I mean, I'm imagining everybody's got different passwords for different logins and are using those sorts of things, but maybe not.
As individuals try to, where you can, and you can increasingly, you probably see you're offered to use 2FA, two-factor authentication wherever you can. Use a VPN from home. Again, VPNs are not perfectly safe, but it's safer than not using one. These are very kind of straightforward things to do. They don't cost a lot of money, and they have other benefits, like you can watch the BBC from Singapore and BBC iPlayer and the likes. So those are two key ones, I'd say. And just, look, when you get an email, I'm super cautious about them now. I'm sure a lot of people are, but just look at who it's coming from, check the address, look for anything fishy. If it's demanding something urgently, there's something fishy about it, just don't even respond. Just delete it.
What about what about securing your own data, right? So one of the one of the things that I'm constantly just blown away by, when Cambridge Analytica, that whole scandal broke, the number one thing was we're all giving away our own data so freely, right? And so every time one of these surveys come up, what color mood are you in today? Oh, you're red, which means that you're passionate or whatever. And I'm like, and every time people share them, I'm like, stop giving your data away. So this is your value.
Yeah.
Why are you giving it away to everyone without thought? And then you expose everyone in your network to this thing.
I don't think that's a huge priority for individuals, but I think that if it's in the Google cloud, it's encrypted at rest, right? So there's this idea of data at rest that Joe probably remembers has been talked about the last couple of days: data at rest, data in motion, data in use. The easiest thing to do is have your data at rest encrypted. If you keep stuff in Google Cloud, that's automatically encrypted, right? So it's hard for somebody to decrypt your data at rest sitting there. On your hard drive, that's a different issue. I know that Microsoft, there's some functionality Microsoft offers, I think Apple as well, that enables you to encrypt local files as well. But I have a feeling you have to pay for some of those services.
Yeah.
So I just all the valuable stuff I just keep in the cloud. I don't have in my local device.
Right.
Interesting.
Okay.
Because I know it's encrypted. I know that. I'm a small business, so I know that those guys have got better security practices and policies than I have on the device that I'm working with now.
And it's in their interest to protect your data, right? Because if they don't, they're going to lose their customer base. So
yeah. Well, they've got by and large best of breed approach to cybersecurity. Those big cloud guys.
So this to me sounds like, it's when Apple did their iOS 14, we're on 15 already. When they did their iOS 14 shift, it was the whole thing was about privacy, and it was about a lot of advertisers lost their links to people because of it. All the play with cookies changed, and privacy became a competitive issue in Apple's eyes anyway. That it just smelt to me like, this is, if Apple is doing this so overtly from a privacy perspective in selling their products, and I hadn't heard the same sort of rhetoric from all the other organizations as big as when Apple did the iOS 14. It just said to me that privacy is going to be a brand war on privacy at some point.
Yeah. Well, to the point, there's value in your data, and the likes of Apple and Google. Obviously, that some of these companies, maybe not Apple so much, but certainly Facebook and Google have been harvesting and monetizing your data for years. But there's value in your data, and if it's just them, and typically people understand, but not everybody, but we kind of know what Google and Facebook do with our data. But what these organizations also realize is that bad actors are looking to steal your data and use it for a variety of reasons, some of which I've described earlier, to put together fake identities that they can then use, or just to sell it on, right, in the dark web.
But
the main thing has been the main thing basically has been the creation of the market. Right, the market is there in terms of what you can do with this information, and also the ability to pay for it now because of all the because of the way crypto works and DeFi and how it's less and less and less traceable. You can cause the damage, you can cause the harm that requires economic value to solve it. And then you've got the means to solve it as well. So because of that, it's really become a point where, I've seen attacks where they automate the process as well of this of churning back the data to get new data. Like on Facebook, a lot of these cyber threats on Facebook are people taking your information, sending you messages so they can get information about your friends, and then from that they get a lead generation kind of thing where out of that process they actually create new leads, and then they take their pick from there. So it's it's very interesting. It's people tend to look at the cyber thing and overcomplicate things. What they're really looking for in the end is human weakness, right? They're just coming back to trying to find a way for you to say hello to me because by the way, Tim said something, and then you go, oh Tim, I know Tim, and then you're off to the races.
But
I mean,
don't you think that Tim Cook is sort of, it's been a couple of years now. He's been publicly going up against Zuckerberg and Facebook, and I think this recent announcement was that they were pushing Facebook to change their ways. It didn't change enough, and so they've taken a hard line, which is going to have a big impact on this last quarter. It didn't impact Facebook advertising revenue, but it's expected to in the next quarter. So it's a big deal. But I think it just comes down to a fundamental disagreement with how Facebook has been running its business and the impact it's having on society. And this is Apple's way of saying it's a middle finger, basically. So we've told you to sort it out. You haven't sorted it out. So we're going to do this to you. So it's a bit of a culture war,
I think what Apple's doing is just coming up with an innovative commercial way to talk about something. That's all it is. I don't think they're really, 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 trying to stop that, because I mean that exchange of privacy to get all the services that you have elsewhere on the net. I mean, I don't know. I think it's just a great marketing ploy. It's to strengthen up the walls around cult of Apple, and and that's basically it. Because I think you still need that access. They're going to become creative ways to do that. I mean, Apple is intrusive, but they do it in their technically correct way, right? They figure ways to scan your information, but they do it in a way where it's a machine that's doing it for them. It doesn't come onto the cloud, but it's still based on a data set which I guess they would have some sort of influence on. They could accidentally flag you as a pedophile, right? I mean.
Yeah, I mean, or on purpose, somebody could on purpose, right? Which is which is one of the scary things about data and how it can be used as identity attributes, as attributes associated with your identity.
All right. So, Andy, do you have any final words, and we'll jump into the next bit?
I think, I mean, I guess back to the kind of point. I think the reality people need to understand is a bit like COVID. It's a bit like a COVID analogy, and the position that the Singapore government and many governments around the world are now taking, which is to say, look, we cannot eliminate it. It's going to come and hit us, but we need a bunch of controls just to try to make sure that the damage that it causes is containable. And I think similarly in the cybersecurity world, don't lie awake all night worrying about a breach getting to you. It's just a case of, should that happen, as an organization, certainly as a company, minimizing the damage that can potentially cause. And I guess as an individual as well. If you've encrypted your data and you get 2FA and so on, there's probably a limit to the damage that an intruder, a malicious actor, can cause. So I think it's just that acknowledgement that it's going to happen. Just make it hard for them as and when it does.
And look out for the misinformation campaigns that are out there to consciously divide us. And
question yourself as well. I mean, to what extent have you as an individual been subject to misinformation? I mean, I know a couple of times I've fallen for some of it in the past.
Yeah. A big tree being chopped down. That was one of my. Well, I didn't double check that one. I try and make sure that if it's a breaking news item, it's got to appear in at least 3 credible sources before it's breaking news. That's kind of my Oh. All right. What other news has captured your attention? Just 1 or 2 funny, quirky.
Actually, can I just ask one last little tiny question for Andrew? And for everybody listening, hey Google, are you listening right now? Yeah.
Okay, Google, stop.
I just turned mine off before I said it. Otherwise, I would be caught. What are your thoughts on these in-home listening devices?
Well, again, I mean, that's expanding the attack surface again, right? So the more of these devices you have like that, I mean, there will be passwords that most people aren't using for them. They will be hackable. So yeah, they're just extending that threat environment.
So I've got 100. Is that
having said it, the functionality of them? I mean, I'm not paranoid. I'm not too paranoid about them yet. Maybe I should be, given that I'm in cybersecurity. But it's the same with your washing machine, your microwave, and lots of devices that are programmable. They're all hackable. So you're never going to be 100%. I wouldn't worry too much about it right now. I think it's businesses really have to worry a lot more about these things at the moment.
Have you got one of these devices, Andy?
I have, yeah.
Oh, have you? Okay, all right. Well, that's sort of.
Yeah, well,
I just refuse. I just refuse to have them. I just like the idea that there's a machine that can listen to every single conversation that you're having.
It's for music. The Google one's for music. It's connected to Spotify, and I mean the kids use it. They just say, look, whatever they want to listen to, and it plays. Or they ask at the time, or they ask it a general knowledge question.
Yep.
Or not general knowledge. Other questions they ask it, right? So they ask it questions. So they can, again, they're kind of used to it.
Yeah. That's right.
Part of their existence, and all their friends have got such devices. So, yeah, they use it more than I use it. I'll use it very occasionally for music. That's about it.
So as IoT sort of progresses, which is presumably where metaverse will also have a big play, I would have thought, where everything is connected.
So IoT is Internet of Things.
Internet of Things. So the one I like. The example I like is you're driving along in your car realizes it's time for service, it checks your calendar, it makes a booking with the service station to book in your service at a time, it notifies this and that, it makes the appointment, notifications are in the calendar, and you didn't have to do anything, you just have to turn up on that date where the appointment's made because everything's done for you.
It's a potential disaster from a cybersecurity perspective. This whole operational technology piece, all these machines converging with information technology, is a potential nightmare.
So that means,
and again, I'm not sorry. I shouldn't be so dramatic, but it just again creates a huge opportunities for hackers who are looking to do more damage. So you just need to build, again, it's risk management. You just need to build in more checks and balances. It's like you're an airline pilot. For you to make a mistake that might cause that plane to crash, you have to make about 15 mistakes on the trot, right? One after the other. Yeah. There's all kinds of checks and balances to stop that from happening.
Yeah.
I think something similar will have to happen to cars as well, right? Or else, potentially we're in trouble.
Yeah. Or then there becomes the opportunity for the trusted brand to have a sort of end-to-end seamless.
So is that Apple's goal?
Which sounds Apple-y, and it might be something that Facebook have decided that they need to play in, and therefore, because nobody trusts Facebook, they need to change their brand. I mean, it just sounds to me like it basically we're heading into a future fraught with more opportunities for technological misuse, and therefore trust becomes a huge commodity and a huge market differentiator between brands. Yep. And then as a result, Apple's already making an early play into that.
In mature markets. So you go to Indonesia, the Philippines, they don't have any qualms about using Facebook as the information source.
Again, I guess it comes down to that, what you were talking about.
I'm generalizing. The vast majority of the population, I'm sure there are some people in Indonesia and the Philippines that do.
Yeah, but it's also, there's also this huge unbanked segment who aren't on Apple phones because you need a credit card to set up an Apple phone account. There's this huge community still of unbanked people, not as many as there used to be. They've sort of worked out how to get data points for the mobile phones typically, but but then we've got then we've got these tipping points coming up, so maybe we won't have to worry about any of it, huh?
Doom and gloom. But these emerging markets are Android territory anyway; they're not Apple territory.
Yeah, exactly.
So we need to be wary when we fork out $20 for the latest piece of technological gadgetry versus the $100 version. Not that it's about the dollars necessarily, but it's about who do you trust that made it.
I think you're right. I think the whoever makes it will over time start building in more security features as people clearly get more concerned about it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But would it also create more divisions if there's these sort of closed loops that are going to be becoming stronger closed loops as we move forward? Obviously, Facebook's metaverse is all encompassing, but then if you think about Apple, if they keep the group smaller, but that there's this other huge part of the global population that'll be sitting on another platform which can do similar things, but it's not the same. Is that something that we should be You're smiling a lot. Is that something that we should be concerned about?
Yeah.
Right.
I think in the Anglosphere we ignore the rest of the world too much and what's going on in the rest of the world, right? It's everyone's aware of what's happening in the English-speaking world, so so everyone in England knows a bit about Australia and America and so on, right? In Singapore, there's I guess in Singapore actually they've got more of a handle on actually China, to be fair, right? China and Taiwan, people have a bit of an understanding of in Singapore as well as the West, right?
Yeah.
But I think you've got this world with very different behaviors, different technology usage patterns, and as I mentioned, different ways they use social media. I mean, Twitter in Indonesia was very widely used, not for business, but for people to communicate, share information, share personal information. Facebook's the platform for information down there, and so on. It's just differently used, and we don't think about it as much. We're just very much focused on the English language side of things on social media, English language misinformation on social media. And it's not something I think we pay enough attention to at all. I mean, I come across this stuff incidentally, just having chats with people in those countries, and they'll say something like, "Ooh, where'd you get that information from?"
Yeah.
And
should I delete my MySpace account?
Actually, I don't think I ever got rid of mine.
Yeah, it's Microsoft. They're pretty.
Yeah, they bought it, right? Didn't they?
Yeah. I think it's a pretty trusted, from a security perspective. They're not invincible. Nobody is, but it's a pretty trusted.
Microsoft or MySpace? Microsoft or MySpace?
Microsoft. So anything that sits under the Microsoft brand, as far as their security and infrastructure goes, right?
I don't think so. Sorry, not that I wish to diss Microsoft at all, but from a corporate perspective, there's a lot of issues around Active Directory. There's a lot of issues, a lot of issues around Microsoft software.
But as far as us,
I mean, it's hard to say it's their fault, because they've got to do there's a trade-off, you see, with Microsoft between things been easy to use and security. So Teams, for example, anyone can set up private groups without IT seeing it. For example, you can bring out outside people in. There's all kinds of potential for security breaches with their collaboration tools. And again, from their perspective, they're thinking they're making it usable, right? So it's a bit unfair to point fingers at them over that, because they make it's easier to use, right? I mean, and this is the trade-off between security and usability that you've always got to play. If you have too many security controls, then whatever you're offering can become unusable. But Active Directory, which is where credentials sit, is a target for hackers when they get into systems. And when I say credentials, that's where passwords and the like all sit.
Yeah.
And it gets hacked very frequently.
Right.
And again, you can't say it's Microsoft's fault. Perhaps the cyber hygiene in the organization is not what it should be. But you talk to a lot of cybersecurity professionals, and they'll say that a lot of the tools they've got with Azure now, for example, are great, top notch. But a lot of cybersecurity professionals will say certainly Active Directory and Teams and some others. I won't go into name too many products. They have some concerns with the management of.
Yeah, right. Okay. Oh, that's interesting.
To put it mildly and politely.
Yeah.
So I don't. Certainly among cybersecurity professionals, they do not have a reputation of being aligned to secure practices.
Right.
Very interesting.
Just finished putting my sell order in online.
The second deepest conversation I've had on cybersecurity.
Second deepest.
What was the deepest?
The deepest one was in a business lounge. I think it was in either Hong Kong or Finland, and I was chatting to this really nice guy and his friend or his colleague, and we were chatting for ages. And at the end, we were having a laugh and talking about nonsense or whatever it was. And at the end, he gave me his card, and it was Eugene Kaspersky.
Oh wow!
Oh
yeah, so it was like cool. And he just said, just in case. I was like, great.
So your reaction to Eugene Kaspersky, whatever it is obviously means something that I'm oblivious to.
His brand is massive in the
cybersecurity
stuff and cybersecurity.
Kaspersky,
yeah, if Andy's impressed, he's obviously impressive. All right, come on. We're coming up to overtime. One piece each. news that caught your attention beyond what we've already talked about?
Well, I was listening to something called Shortwave, which is a short form science program on NPR. And apparently spiders are scared of spiders. It was some accidental research that they found, and they realized that spiders. We don't think of spiders as prey. We think of them as predators, right? But even amongst themselves, I mean, if you catch two spiders and you put them together, you come back later and you find one spider. It's because, well, one will probably have fed on the other. And yeah, so spiders are actually scared of spiders, and certain features make spiders scarier to spiders, and it has mostly to do with large eyes.
Wow.
Nice eyes.
Interesting, Tim.
Shows your pupils. Pass. I was thinking about the
you
spiders.
haven't had a news
something else now.
Andy, have you? What else is?
It's hardly news, really, is it? Yeah, it is news for a lot of people, and it's very specific. But I was just interested in Manchester United losing 5-0 at home to Liverpool. I don't know if anyone was aware of that. Just what on earth's going on there?
Are you a Liverpool supporter?
No, I'm a Sheffield United supporter, and I'm in a dismal team. But I'm just interested in the EPL generally, and I'm just. I'm a Manchester United supporter, and I watched that game. I went to bed at halftime. Yeah, but it's big news, right? It's big news from an EPL perspective. And it's at home, and I don't think they've lost to that degree for some time. Certainly not against Liverpool for many years, if at all. And so you just start questioning it. What is it? Is it the manager? I mean, he's pretty sure soon Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, who was a kind of hero for Man United fans. Is it the manager? Is having Ronaldo back a problem? Is it all about Ronaldo? I don't know how.
I think it's a bit of a perfect storm.
Yeah.
This may not interest everybody, but I'm happy to have a big chat with you about it. Because I think it's a perfect storm. I think Ronaldo has upset the balance because you need to build the team around him, and it hasn't been built around him, and he has such a big impact. Ole is an inexperienced manager with a huge team, but he knows the Manchester United way. And so as a result, he's got the culture operating in a Manchester United way, which the other elite managers couldn't do because they were operating in their own way. And so it changed a few things, but he can't get them to that next level that elite manager could. So finding that person's interesting. But then there's been commentary about other teams also losing 5-0 and I think it was Liverpool talking about, no, it was Gary Neville talking about how he played in a 5-0 losing team. It was away. One year where they either won it or they won it the following year or something. So they're saying it's a blip, but these days, because of social media, the blip is very noisy.
Is that Gary Neville on Instagram?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I watch his commentary occasionally on Instagram.
Yep.
Jamie Carragher, right? With him.
Is either Gary Neville or who's the one that's coaching? Anyway, we're possibly
coaching the England women's team.
Well, I'm on the verge of going into screensaver mode. I
feel like we might be losing people with this one, but it's that has.
We might be getting people very excited and interested in this conversation.
Somebody hack somebody quickly.
Yeah, a lot of people find talking about the EPL a lot more interesting than cybersecurity.
Well, it is an escape, isn't it? It's an escape.
Yeah.
And
all right. Tim, do you have a news one?
Oh, Spanx was my news.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah, you put it in.
I went in early on that one.
Yeah, you did. All right. So mine is. Do you know Nicholas Kristof, who's a columnist for the New York Times? He wrote a book with his wife Cheryl called Half the Sky. Anyway, he's brilliant, he's been on the front lines covering genocide, you name it, for a few decades. Anyway, he has resigned from the New York Times. Yeah, brilliant. It's a really great book. He's resigned from the New York Times and he's running for governor of Oregon, which I think is absolutely awesome. And it's a real. He's sick of seeing so much sorrow and horror overseas, and then he started coming back and seeing it himself. He's been writing some columns which has been talking about things like people he went to school with have died of overdoses and they're homeless, and he's just had enough, and he said, right, that's it. I'm going to see if I can actually do something about it. So I thought that was a really, All right. And then the final bit, what's keeping you distracted at the moment?
This is always a good one.
You mean, what do you mean, literally at the moment, or just in your mind thoughts? What do you mean?
Well, clean version. No, it's like what are you watching on TV? What movies are you going to go see? All that sort of stuff.
Netflix binge watching.
Well, this
is a way of harvesting your password,
gets
by the way.
political because I'm obsessed with what's going on in the US with the Republican Party and the way they appear to be rejecting democracy. And it's quite scary because I think if the US goes, then we're all in trouble.
Yeah.
Again, that's just my kind of view. And I've been tracking, what one of the techniques, there's a whole bunch of techniques. We could spend a long time talking about this, but so I'm watching the Virginia governor election race. And what they're identifying is that a lot of Democrats think the beast has been slayed, as in Trump's out, and they're just not that motivated by politics, and the Biden administration isn't particularly dynamic or interesting. So a lot of them are just kind of tuning out altogether. So mobilizing them to vote is very difficult. But what Trump is doing, and the Trump supporters, just keeping that base angry all the time. And just keeping. I mean, he did actually say they shouldn't vote at all, which is perhaps a good thing. But but they're angry, right? They're engaged and angry in a way that they still believe the election was stolen and so on. And the support that he's getting among Republicans and in the Republican Party is increasing, not decreasing. And his way of thinking. And I'm just watching that, to be quite honest, in horror because of the narratives that are coming out being more widely believed. It was Antifa and the FBI that did January the 6th, that kind of narrative just being believed.
Wow.
Those crazy conspiracy theories just being believed by a very large proportion of people. And some of those people, presumably reasonably intelligent, right?
So this is how you escape. You escape by going into American politics.
Well, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't do it. I really shouldn't. I tried Squid Games, but I found that just too dark and distressing. I'll go for American politics.
I walked past my wife watching Squid Games. I went, "What's that?" And she goes, "Squid Games." I go, blah, 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 blah. And I looked at it for about 2 minutes and went, "I think I know the entire show." And which is effectively Arnold Schwarzenegger movies from the 80s, but just set in Korea. And Running Man was exactly that, right? Hunger Games a little bit, but
Hunger Games, it's a bit like, right?
Yeah, I just want to point out that Andy said basically that the end of democracy as we know it is slightly less disturbing than Squid Game.
I didn't mean it like that, but it's...
But you can see why Andy and I have been friends for so long, because our pleasure is that stuff, reading that stuff. That's why we've been able to have so many great chats. But I'm paying attention to, probably not as deeply as you, Andy, but there's just some recent stuff coming out around it as well, and you can't take your eye off the ball. At the moment,
the other one I'm fixated on is what's going on in the South China Sea and with Taiwan as well, because it's not getting a lot of coverage. So you're getting these big flotillas, you're getting these massive aircraft carrier fleets actually stopping in Singapore and just hanging around off the Philippine Sea, just saying to China, "Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough." More or less, right? Or put a foot wrong and you're in trouble, kind of thing. And we're taking this seriously, right? Rather than as an argument that they went too easy on their claims in the South China Sea for a period of time. And similarly, around Taiwan. So a lot of them have been posturing around Taiwan, but there's a lot of hot military activity going on as well. That again, it's not the most light and easy reading, but it's
it is fascinating.
Something that I've been tracking. Yeah. I mean, they had that big that big British aircraft carrier come through here recently, the Queen Elizabeth.
Yeah.
New one.
It's all we need. It's all we need.
Singapore, and Singapore's position on it's interesting. Joe's probably got more of a view on this than me, but where does Singapore sit in all of this? Because they're doing all these exercises with these Americans and the British and the Western powers as they come through, but at the same time they're keen to stay on the right side of China. So it's a difficult balancing act.
Yeah, the dance in Asia is interesting to watch. But anyway, look, we're coming up to 2 hours, so you guys all right if we just wrap up now, unless you've got something incredible to offer from a distraction point of view. And Andy, come and join us again, because I know that I know that you're really passionate about the news as well, and we can sort of talk about other things. Maybe have a good conversation about what's going on in China and bring some awareness.
Yeah.
We've been talking about some of the stuff. I think it was just last week. It feels like China's closing off to me, and I think we should be paying attention to what's going on. We should, all of us. But thank you so much for coming. It's just really fantastic just to hear your point of view, and I always enjoy a good chat. I'll download this and upload this onto Uncommon Courage, the podcast, if you want to listen to it as an audio. But otherwise, we'll see you next week, and in the next couple of weeks, we're probably going to be focused on COP26. So. So I'll be sharing a lot about that, but that's what's coming up. And let's hope that the leaders of our world are smart enough to understand that the time to act is now. So thanks for being here, guys.
Well, thanks for having me. I've loved it today. It's been great talking with you all.
Yeah, it's been nice to have you here, Andrew. It's been a nice chat until you brought up the 5-0 bit, but everything else has been great.
I was trying to lighten things up a bit then when I did that.
The dark cloud came
Joe
over
was
me.
doing very well also in that.
Yeah, remember, if things in life ever get too
predicted.
serious, I'll always remember we can think about the end of democracy as we know it.
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
going to miss out on the next couple of weeks. I'll be. I've got other things that I must be at, but I look forward to joining everybody again after that.
All right.
Take care,
And so
everyone.
maybe you can come back next week, Andy. We'll need an extra leg. All right.
Just let me know anytime.
Cool. All right. See you guys.
Cheers, guys.